Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for being here today. I think you've been informed that the governor had a previously scheduled event in Hastings and could not be here. This afternoon, as you well know, the Judiciary Committee of our legislature will be holding a public hearing on Legislative Bill 110, which proposes to legalize marijuana in Nebraska. We're hosting just a few of the people who are weighing in on this issue, either through written testimony or perhaps personal testimony before the committee later today. Governor Ricketts has worked very, very hard during his tenure in office to advocate for policies that protect our families while also encouraging innovative medical research. The governor and I have opposed attempts to legalize marijuana through the legislative process because we believe that the tried and tested avenue for developing safe and effective pharmaceutical drugs runs through our research universities and the Food and Drug Administration review process. Today, several people who plan to testify or have submitted written testimony have joined us to share why they believe legalizing marijuana under the guise of medicine outside of the traditional regulatory process would hurt our families and our communities. We have with us today Coach Tom Osborne, who needs no introduction, State Patrol Colonel John Bolduc, Behavioral Health Director Sherry Dawson, Mary Hilton, a citizen of Lincoln, former Senator Jim Jensen, who once chaired the Health Committee in the legislature, and we're going to attempt to pull in I think we've done it, Dr. Kevin Sabat via Skype. Each of them are here today to share their perspective on what LB 110 and legalizing marijuana would mean for the state of Nebraska. With that, if we could please hear from Coach Tom Osborne.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here today. And I had made somewhat of a pledge to stay out of the political arena, and here I am. I would like to clarify that I was not asked to come. I volunteered to come because I think this is really an important issue, and so nobody drugged me here. And I would say my primary interest has been young people. I've dealt with them most of my life, and so as a football coach, we started drug testing our players back in 1985. That was the first time that we had the available technology to do so. And so we didn't have a very high percentage of positive drug tests, probably in the 2 to 3% range was all we had. But of that 2 to 3%, about 90% involved marijuana. And we would always notify our incoming players, the first-year players, that we were going to do drug testing. And so we'd send that letter out in June, so we were well prepared. And so we'd invariably have 2 or 3 guys that would be positive. And so we would implement our protocol, which was number 1, to notify parents, and secondly, to evaluate them and try to determine the severity of the problem, put them in counseling, and begin a regular drug testing protocol. Second event would be suspension from play. Third event was dismissal. And unfortunately, the great majority of those guys who showed up positive were gone within about 6 months. And usually in going through the evaluation, we found that they had started in usually 6th, 7th grade with marijuana. And by that time, the habit had become established well enough that it was very difficult to break and sometimes almost impossible. And so you had a lot of guys with a lot on the line. They had scholarship on the line, the opportunity to play football, and yet even with that on the line, they were not able to stay away from marijuana. So that led me to believe that this idea that marijuana is not addictive is a myth. It's not dangerous is a myth. And I think that the public needs to be aware of that. So my experience with these young people led me to believe that the research on marijuana is verified, and that is that, number 1, marijuana usage interferes with short-term memory. You got to know the snap count if you're going to run a football play, and it's important to have good short-term memory. Secondly, it does interfere with motor skills. You're not quite as coordinated as you would be if you weren't on it. And then thirdly, and probably the most devastating effect that we noticed, was simply the inability to be motivated, to be focused, to get out of bed and in the morning and go to strength training, be on time for things, go to class. And so it was pretty much a recipe for failure in almost any area of endeavor where high performance was required. And so, as I said, the main concern I have is the impact on young people, and yet this bill that is before us, I guess, is not necessarily aimed at young people. So you may say, well, why are you worried about it? Because there has been some research that indicates that early marijuana usage does seem to impact brain development, and also is associated with certain types of mental illness, where areas of marijuana usage have increased significantly. You also see higher levels of schizophrenia, not just in younger people, where it usually shows up in late teens, early 20s, but with older people who have been using marijuana. So it does seem that there are some attendants, mental illnesses that are part of the process. So I think that favorable legislation, even medical marijuana, somehow legitimizes the usage of marijuana in the minds of many people, and that has been a concern. Some people say there's really no difference between marijuana and alcohol. That was not our experience, because you see, alcohol is water soluble. It leaves the system in somewhere between 5 and 6 to 7 hours maximum. And marijuana is stored in fat cells in the body, and so it's detectable for 5 to 6 weeks. So there is some residual impact of the active agent in marijuana over an extended period of time. And if you examine some of the data coming out of Colorado since legalization, you see what has happened with traffic accidents and all kinds of other social problems that have developed from that. And I believe that's part of the residual effect. And so in the 1990s, the THC level, which is the psychoactive part of marijuana, which affects the brain and thought process and creates the high. In the 1990s, that THC level was generally around 4%. Currently, you find those THC levels around 20 to 30% and some much higher. So the impact of the psychoactive element, THC, has increased exponentially by a roughly 6 to 7-fold degree. So this type of marijuana is much more potent, I think, as others will testify. The legislation before us, is, at least as I know it right now, has no control on the THC potency. And that's unusual because most marijuana that's labeled marijuana, medical marijuana, has some type of limits which reduce it to either low level, very low levels, or no THC at all. And so this pretty much throws the lid off of that. The list of qualifying symptoms for medical marijuana are exceedingly broad in this case, which means an awful lot of people would be able to acquire that label of medically handicapped people where you can access marijuana. And so there's also no restrictions on marijuana delivery systems. Could be in edibles, could be in candy, could be vaping, all kinds of things, which may in some cases be particularly appealing to young people. And I do know that in Colorado they've seen a rise in the incidence of young people, children particularly, who've been taken to emergency rooms because of the consumption, particularly of edible types of marijuana. So there are some side effects that would be rather dangerous. And so I think that I know that I agree with the Attorney General in that most drugs which are labeled for medical purposes are FDA approved, subject to rigorous testing. And I think in almost all of these cases, you have not seen that with most forms of medical marijuana. And so we think that some caution there is deserved. And so finally, let me say this. saw some people out in the hall when I came in, and there are many people who have families that are challenged physically in some way, and either they believe or they have evidence in their own experience that somehow marijuana would help. And we certainly have great sympathy for those people. And we understand that maybe at some point there will be enough research to validate those findings. But I think it is really important when we look at the greater good, because there will be some people that will be impacted one way or another because of medical challenges. But I think it's really important to realize the number of young people and the number of people in the culture in general that will be impacted in a negative way by this movement. And I call it a movement, not necessarily legislation. And so I think we need to count that cost. And as I stand here, I would have to say that the verdict comes down on the side of the greatest number that impact the greatest good for our state at this point, because we have a pretty good quality of life here. So that's why I'm here today, and that's why I wanted to mention these things, and just hope the people of the state really study the issue and consider this very carefully. So, for me.
Thank you. Before we hear from the Colonel, I just want to thank the state senators who are present. I see Senator John Lowe here, Senator Joni Albright, and Senator Suzanne Geis. Thank you, Senators, for joining us. Colonel Bolduc.
Great, thank you, Lieutenant Governor. Thank you, Coach. Thank you all for being here today, Senators. My name is John Bolduc, Colonel with the Nebraska State Patrol. My testimony today is going to be in opposition to this legislative bill. Frankly, this bill and other efforts to legalize marijuana medically in other states have been ripe with unintended consequences. The unintended consequences that certainly have been experienced in other states will be experienced here. Specifically, we have consequences to traffic safety. We have seen an increase in traffic crashes and traffic fatalities in states where medical marijuana has been legalized, and certainly in states where recreational marijuana has been legalized. In Colorado, when medical marijuana was legalized prior to their ballot initiative, we saw increases in traffic crashes and an increase in fatalities there. Recent studies in Oregon, as well as California, have shown the same thing. Another unintended consequence is the diversion of products to the black market. In my previous job, I was a police chief in California. At the time I was there, it was a medical marijuana state. We saw massive amounts of diversion from what was considered the legal medical market into the black market. Now, you may be aware that those folks who control the black market and who profit from the black market are not necessarily law-abiding citizens. They are involved in all sorts of crime. It is run by organized crime, it is run by gangs, it is run by drug trafficking organizations, it's even run by the cartels out of Mexico. So the diversion of those products is a significant concern, and other states who have been there haven't been able to crack that nut yet. And I don't believe we would be the first. In addition to the traffic safety problems, the diversion of the products, we also potentially run afoul of federal firearms regulations, which is important to us at the Nebraska State Patrol, because we have to administer the federal firearm regulations. We could inadvertently issue firearms carry and possession permits to folks who are not eligible to do so under federal law. So there are many unintended consequences to this legislation, and we need to think very carefully before we go down this path, and this legislation is problematic from those terms. Lieutenant Governor?
Thank you, Colonel. Now we'll hear from the Behavioral Health Director, Sherry Dawson.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and I want to see maybe if Coach Osborne, Dr. Osborne, could just be a consultant for behavioral health, because I would just reiterate a lot of the points that he made. Certainly the FDA approval issue is of most concern. We need to be able to ensure Nebraskans that there is a dosage that's known, that's reproducible, and really a decision that's not made by the public, and move forward in a manner of really it's safe until proven otherwise. And so part of the opportunity we have is to really ensure the protection of all Nebraskans. Also, from a department standpoint with public health, we have had so many prevention efforts really looking at healthy pregnancies. There's unintended consequences and research related to pregnancies with young people and the developing brain and the impacts to illnesses and just dysfunction really on into their adulthood. And we have evidence really at the Hastings Regional Center. And the Hastings Regional Center serves young men with substance use disorders. And if we look at their drugs of use and abuse as they enter, the number 1 is cannabis, number 2 is alcohol, and number 3 is sedatives. And while there's varying studies related to the opportunity for addiction, we know that there is a percentage that will try marijuana even for a day and be addicted. And so that opportunity for us to ensure from a public health and policy standpoint and behavioral health is just critical that Nebraskans really ensure that we can provide safety and healthy lives.
Thank you, Sherry. Now we'll hear from Mary Hilton, who's a mom and a citizen of Lincoln.
Hi, I'm here today because I have a daughter who has epilepsy. She's 19 years old, and she's had epilepsy for about the last 18 years. It is not controlled well by medication or other treatments that we have undergone. She has 30 to 40 seizures still every day. And we're still looking for that silver bullet that will bring her relief. She can't drive, and there's obvious ramifications to that for her self-esteem. But I'm just here today because I see this as very dangerous legislation. I see it as putting the sick and the suffering of our state in a giant medical experiment. It is not a silver bullet, and it is often touted as a cure-all to help the sick and the suffering, and the medical evidence doesn't support that. And so until the day that the medical proof is out there that the benefits from cannabis products outweigh all the negative side effects that have already been mentioned here, it is dangerous for this state to be touting it and promoting it as though it is a good thing. It's a very dangerous thing. And it's very scary from the standpoint of a mom with actually lots of children and having to have them grow up in a state where marijuana first is legal medically and then likely would become legal recreationally. And that's a very dangerous outlook from my perspective. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Now we'll hear from former State Senator Jim Jensen.
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I spent 12 years here in the legislature, all in Health and Human Services Committee, 8 years as chairman. I also had the honor of serving on 3 years for the National Institute of Health. Nebraska is so fortunate in that we do have hospitals and research facilities that have come up with some great cutting-edge therapies and also medicine to work with our citizens. And when Nebraska brought in the tobacco settlement money, which was $1.165 billion, we put that into a trust fund that would fund research here in Nebraska for the next perhaps 25 years. Now, certainly the legislature, when I was there, cannot demand or even tell another legislature what to do. But we have that research ability to look at those issues. You know, I often think I was at high school when we had polio shots, Salk vaccine came out. that was not approved by a legislative body. That was run through the medical society. This is where I think we should be directing our efforts. We have the facilities. Certainly, we also have found out in my years of being here that and Sherry would certainly back this up, that about half of those people with behavioral health issues have an occurrence of either alcohol or marijuana along with that. So to make that more available, I think would be a mistake for this state. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Jensen. We've also been joined by Dr. Sorrell of the Department of Health and Human Services. This time we're going to try to test our technology here, and Dr. Kevin Sabat, if you'd like to address us at this time, we'd love to hear from you.
To be there in person. I know staff is on his way. The flight from Reagan Airport was 2.5 hours delayed, but Justice Clarence Thomas was on his plane apparently, so that was a good thing. And he's very excited to be joining all of you in Lincoln. But for now, I want to thank you for having me kind of Skyped in and really add to the wonderful comments that have been made by everybody. You know, medicine is not a popularity contest. It's not something that we take a vote on. Medicine is something that happens through the scientific process. And when I read the bill and the different proposals, we have to be very clear to separate this, that this really is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It reads almost like Colorado's legalization. It doesn't read like something for a last resort for somebody with 6 months to live who has no other option. I think in that case, we all have compassion no matter what they wanted to do, but that is not how this bill reads at all. It reads as if there would be 9,600 joints allowed. 9,600, pills wouldn't be allowed for anything, let alone there should be 9,600 joints. The bill is clearly written in my mind as a stalking horse for really the full commercialization of drugs and of marijuana in particular. And as was said, today's marijuana is not the marijuana of the past. It's being marketed by big tobacco companies. It's being produced by major Wall Street investors whose only goal is to make money. And if they can put a green cross on it for now in Nebraska and say that it's about the sick and dying, they will do that on their road to billions. And I think the message is, let's slow down. Let's get people what they need medically that works. Let's remember there are multiple FDA medications approved already that are based on marijuana that are not smoked. They are not left for individuals to hope that their product isn't contaminated, because in most of these medical marijuana states are actually selling contaminated marijuana because it's not FDA approved. These are not FDA approved labs. And there's just a whole host of problems. So I would really say slow down. No, I don't think anyone's going to prison with 6 months to live who uses marijuana. So that's not a problem that needs fixing. I've looked at the data in your state. And the reality is, I think the people pushing this very, very quickly are, I know they are, they're the DC interests that are funded by the marijuana and, by the way, the tobacco industries. I've looked at their records and I've seen that. So I'm concerned about that. We don't want a stalking horse. We already have a terrible problem with opioids, but we know that no kid starts using drugs by injecting heroin in their veins. That's not how drug use starts. Drug use starts with the entrant drugs like alcohol, which is already legal. Train has left the station there. Tobacco, and of course marijuana. Why would we compound our problems and allow a massive industry? So make no mistake about it. I've read the bill and I've read a lot of the other bills, marijuana around the country, most of them. This is not about medicine. This is really about the full commercialization of cookies, candies, edibles, which will eventually, I know, be passed if this passes, because that's all the road it takes. It doesn't just stop at for the sick and dying. So let's remember what this is really about, do our research. Let science, not popularity contests or special interest money, determine what medicine is so that we can all stay safe. And of course, let's be compassionate. Let's get people what they need. Let's remember the sick and dying. But this is clearly, to me, it is not about those truly suffering. We can write a law for those folks, but this one certainly isn't it. We have to be very cautious here. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sabat. There are others who will be testifying this afternoon in opposition to the bill. But let me pause at this point and open it up to the press for any questions you may have of myself or any of the speakers here today.
We'll take a few questions, and then after we wrap up, if I know we want to be respectful of people's time, we can hang around for other Q&A that might be still lingering.
Please.
A question for Mary.
Yes.
There are others with children in somewhat the same situation, and they talk about the drugs that those children are getting that are also, in their view, dangerous drugs, labeled dangerous drugs. How do you feel about that?
Well, I understand the desperation that those parents feel. You want to do what is find the optimal treatment for your child, and when you can't find it, it's disheartening, and you keep searching. And the difference with, though, all the other anti-epileptic drugs is that we know what those things are. There's scientific proof. We know the drug interactions that they have with one another. And with marijuana, a lot of it's a mystery, and the evidence remains to be seen on how severe all those side effects will be.
Sir, the Howard Patrolman. The doctor brought up, starting off marijuana and going into heroin. But isn't part of the problem that the people that are buying marijuana are also buying it from people that are selling heroin? I mean, wouldn't this be a way of monitoring who's getting the marijuana and actually maybe stop some of the more dangerous drugs like the opiates that are causing such a problem? That would be another question, sir. Are opiates a bigger problem in the state than marijuana?
Well, it depends on what your metric is. If your metric is the number of kids starting and using drugs, there are far many more people using marijuana than opiates. If your metric is overdose deaths among the average user, which is a 45-year-old white male with 20 years of addiction, then obviously opiates, because they act on the brainstem, which kills people, is a bigger problem. But in drug policy, in this case, it's not an either or. And to answer your first question, people don't get marijuana from the dealer they get heroin from. That's not how drug markets work. I have a PhD. I've studied drug markets for 25 years. Drug markets work. Most people get marijuana from, and especially kids, but even others, from a friend, unfortunately family member, and usually for free, someone they know, especially in the very beginning. So this is not about somebody who is going to a drug dealer who then says, I've tried marijuana, so can you give me something better? The other thing that question presupposes is that you're getting rid of the drug dealer by legalizing, which actually the black market has exploded. The drug dealers, they are still selling to people under 21. They are still selling to anyone who doesn't want to pay the state tax, and there are a lot of people who don't like to pay taxes, period, let alone on marijuana. And they're selling it to people who buy it out of hours and from people who don't have to comply with anything, and so they're thriving. And that's why we've seen foreign drug cartels infiltrate multiple legal states. So I understand where you're coming from. If it was an either-or proposition, wouldn't we rather have somebody using a joint than using heroin? That's not the real-world reality of addiction. Drug markets, in this case with marijuana and heroin, are very, very different. You don't go to that same person. And number two, if you're depending on your metric, whether it's deaths or whether it's sheer number of users or whether it's car deaths, if you look at the number one drug for car death, number one illegal drug, that's marijuana. And by the way, the number one drug period is a legal one, alcohol. And the reason is not because alcohol, so much something is with alcohol, but the fact that it's legal makes it commercialized and promoted and normalized. So that's why I was saying, why would we want to do that with another drug, especially when this industry has increased its potency? People need to realize this is not your daddy's, let alone your granddaddy's marijuana. This is 10 to 50 times stronger, genetically bred in a way, in an edible or a wax. It's not about a joint being passed around. A lot of baby boomers have an image of pot that's Cheech and Chong in the dorm room. That is not what today's marijuana is. If you talk to any person in their mid-20s in Denver who uses marijuana regularly and who is addicted, I promise you it's not from joints. It's from the concentrates, the waxes, the things that give you a better eye. So, we need to really look at that when we look at drug policy.
Let me just put a finer point on that. I've been a law enforcement officer for 33 years. I've met a lot of meth addicts. I've met a lot of heroin addicts. I've never met an addict who was addicted to heroin, who was addicted to meth, who didn't start with marijuana.
Did he walk from a heroin or meth dealer?
No, sir. The gentleman is correct. When you're going to go find marijuana, you're going to find a different kind of dealer than you are from a meth dealer. That doesn't mean that those drugs aren't intermixed, but the access to it. And that's one challenge with this proposed legislation, the access to it, just like the addiction that we have in young people to Valium or other prescription drugs. Sometimes they don't have to go any further than their family's medicine cabinet. Now this is going to be on that menu of options, and we think that's bad public policy.
And just, doctor, could you clarify, are you a medical doctor or PhD? We didn't get your credentials.
I'm a PhD in public policy from Oxford. I served in 3 White House administrations. I do not take a partisan point of view. I actually served for almost 3 years in the Obama administration, where I advocated against legalization. I will tell you something quickly, too. Let me just clarify the record, though, just to make sure you understand me, too. Most people who use marijuana will not go on to heroin. Of course, most people who drink don't go on to other drugs. That's the case. However, 95% of heroin users one of their starter drugs was marijuana. So we're not saying everyone who's going to use marijuana is going to go use heroin, so let's, make sure it's safer or whatever for them. But you do not start using drugs. If you ended up on heroin, you didn't start with heroin. And we have to understand that nexus. Science is still teasing that out. The bottom line is this piece of legislation that allows 9,600 joints, frankly, almost anybody who says they're sick, that's not really medicine. And we all want to see marijuana. I would love to see marijuana-based medications, more of them, approved by the FDA. In fact, I have pushed for research, and that's happening. We already have multiple FDA medications. We absolutely need more. I don't want to put people in prison for smoking a joint. That's not what this is about, certainly not if you're sick. But we have to do it the right way through the FDA. This bill that I've read, at least, what was presented to me, isn't the right way.
The alternative to this proposal is likely going to be a much broader measure which will be presented to voters through an initiative petition drive. And wouldn't you rather have this kind of regulatory setup that the legislature can control?
I'll let the legislators answer that before I have to sign off. I'll just take that all experience with that part of it. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors with the pot industry, and they love to threaten people by saying, we're going to take it to the voters, and then they're going to do something broader. If they're going to do that, I promise you they're going to do that anyway. In other words, they're not going to say, oh, you passed a tight legislative proposal, so we're going to go home now. No. If they have the money to run the initiative, I promise you they're going to run it either way. I think what makes sense for the state to do is reject actually, this is broad, maybe not broad compared to what the industry would do, but this is generally broad. Why would you do that when you could actually have a compassionate access program with the FDA for the truly sick and dying and that kind of thing? But I wouldn't necessarily cede to the threats of the pot industry who love that they will run things in every state. They have money, but they're actually focused on full legalization in 3 very expensive states next year: Ohio, Florida, and Arizona. Will be very expensive, and I'm not sure, no offense to anyone in your great state, that they're going to come to Nebraska and want to pass something as their first priority. That's just the reality on the ground that I have seen. And I want to thank everybody for having me. I'm happy to answer press comments afterwards. You all can get in touch with me from the governor's office or the AG's office, can give my email. And I'm very proud to stand here with these fine professionals. Thank you.
Well, I guess I will double down on what was said already. But regardless of the outcome of this legislation, the interests, again, from a billion-dollar industry, the interests who want to see marijuana legalized in this state or any other state will still move forward with those initiatives to try to convince the public that this is a good idea and bring it to a ballot, whether it's in 2020, which we've already seen efforts to do that, or at some other point in the future. We've already read the script. We've read the playbook from other states. Start with medical marijuana, go with recreational marijuana. If you can't get your way there, go with a ballot initiative. And really, it's all about big money coming in, flooding the airwaves with advertisements, and that will come to our state sooner or later, and it's our job to educate the public to say, enter this with your eyes wide open. And that's our message to the legislature. Enter into this lightly, have your eyes wide open, have all the facts, know what the unintended consequences are, because other folks have been there before, and it's not a pretty picture.
We have time for a final question, and then we'll wrap things up. If there's precedent questions afterwards, we can help facilitate one.
Yes, sir.
Question for the Colonel. You talked about the increase in traffic accidents in Colorado and Oregon, but those states have also been seeing tremendous population growth. Is there an actual causation that you're aware of between the legalization and the increase in accidents?
You know, it's interesting. You know, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a social scientist, but rapid increase in population in Colorado, at least, coincides very closely with the passing of recreational marijuana. So, maybe a cottage industry there in some respects. But we have some pretty solid data from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that's showing a causation between access to marijuana, legalization of marijuana, and accidents, including fatal accidents. Now, there's plenty of studies out there that say, no, it's only based on population. But when you're finding an increase in deaths that are attributable to operating a motor vehicle under the influence of marijuana, that's irrespective of relative population. So we need to be careful of that. We already have 220 or so deaths on our highways in Nebraska today. I hate to think of another couple dozen fatalities that our troopers have to respond to, families that we have to notify. That's a frightening possibility for me.
Do you think that there's not a lot of smoking and using marijuana going on in the state right now?
No, I think there is, and I think this will only make it worse.
All right, thank
Why
you
why
all.
no medical doctors on in the organization? Why no medical doctors to talk about why it shouldn't be used?
There will be some medical doctors testifying at the hearing today. We have Dr. Sorrell and others will be testifying at the public hearing.
Thank you all for joining. Once again, if you have other